Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Evan Harper had never touched a woman, not romantically, not intimately, not even a casual brush of fingers when passing someone on the street. At 28, he was worth $500 million and could buy anything in the world except the courage to look a beautiful woman in the eye without his hands trembling. The contract on his mahogany desk changed everything. Surrogate services agreement. It read in cold, clinical typography, for the express purpose of producing an heir to the Harper family fortune. His parents had orchestrated this before leaving for their 6-month European expansion tour, setting everything in motion while Evan was distracted by a major software launch. Now, someone was coming to his door. The soft chime of his private elevator sent ice through Evan's veins. He stood frozen in his home office, surrounded by the blue glow of computer screens that had been his constant companions. His fingers, usually so confident on keyboards, now trembled as he reached for his coffee mug. The ceramic slipped, shattering against the marble floor in a symphony of destruction that seemed to announce the end of his carefully constructed isolation. "Damn," he whispered, his voice rusty from conducting business meetings via video conference for the past month. His company ran smoothly through his brilliant team and automated systems, but Evan's personal isolation had grown worse since his parents left. The elevator chimed again, followed by the soft whisper of doors opening. Evan's heart hammered against his ribs as footsteps echoed across his foyer light. Feminine steps that seemed to dance across the polished marble. His building's concierge had strict instructions to announce all visitors, but the contract had included override codes for this specific situation. "Mr. Harper," the voice was like warm honey poured over velvet, rich and melodious with just a hint of nervousness that made something deep in Evan's chest tighten. "I'm Lila Bennett. I believe your parents arranged for me to come." Lila Bennett, the name from the contract, the woman hired to give him a child. Evan closed his eyes, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. His therapist had warned him this day would come when his parents would stop accepting his excuses about focusing on business and start taking matters into their own hands. He just hadn't expected it to happen like this. "Mr. Harper," she called again, her voice closer now. "I know this is awkward, but perhaps we could talk. I drove all the way from Brooklyn in this storm." Something in her tone, a mixture of determination and vulnerability, made Evan open his eyes. Through the crack in his office door, he caught his first glimpse of her. She was breathtaking. Lila Bennett stood in his foyer like a goddess who had accidentally wandered into a tech mogul's sterile domain. Her natural hair framed a face that belonged in Renaissance painting-shy cheekbones, full lips that curved in an uncertain smile, and the most expressive brown eyes Evan had ever seen. She wore a simple black dress that hugged curves in all the right places. And when she shifted nervously from foot to foot, Evan felt something stir in him that he'd never experienced before. Raw, electric attraction. His mouth went dry, his palms began to sweat, every muscle in his body tensed as if preparing for flight, though he couldn't decide if he wanted to run toward her or away from her. "I know you're here," Lila said gently, setting a small purse on his coffee table. "Your parents explained that you're shy. I want you to know I'm not here to judge you or pressure you into anything you're not comfortable with." Evan pressed harder against the wall, wishing he could disappear entirely. How was he supposed to have a conversation with this woman? How was he supposed to look at her without stammering like a teenager? How was he supposed to explain that, despite being worth $500 million, he'd never even held hands with a woman, let alone done what his parents were expecting him to do? "I have the contract here," Lila continued, pulling a manila folder from her purse. "It specifies a 6-month arrangement with specific expectations. But honestly, I'd rather just talk first, get to know each other before we worry about business arrangements." She moved further into his living room, and Evan watched her take in his space, the minimalist furniture, the wall of windows overlooking Central Park, the complete absence of personal touches that might indicate a human being actually lived here. Her expression was curious rather than judgmental, which somehow made everything worse. "I studied literature at Columbia," she said conversationally, as if she were chatting with an old friend rather than talking to an empty room. "I love books, rainy afternoons, and terrible romantic comedies. I'm probably the only person in New York who still writes in a paper journal instead of typing everything on a computer. Despite his terror, Evan found himself leaning closer to the door crack. Her voice was hypnotic, drawing him in despite every instinct screaming at him to hide. I'm also broke, Lila admitted with a rueful laugh. My mother has stage 3 cancer, and the medical bills are destroying our family. The contract offers enough money to save her life, which is why I'm here, Mr. Harper. Not because I'm some kind of professional. I'm just a graduate student desperate enough to answer a very unusual classified ad. The honesty in her voice hit Evan like a physical blow. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because she needed to be. Just like he was hiding because he needed to hide. Evan took a shaky breath and stepped away from the wall. His reflection in the window showed him what Lila would see if he revealed himself. A tall, lean man with dark hair that hadn't been cut in months, wearing a wrinkled Harvard t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He looked exactly like what he was, a reclusive millionaire who had forgotten how to interact with the world. "Miss Bennett," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila turned toward the sound, her face lighting up with relief and something that might have been genuine pleasure. "There you are. Please, call me Lila." Evan stepped into the doorway but remained frozen there, gripping the frame like a lifeline. When their eyes met across the room, something electric passed between them, a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with the contract and everything to do with the way she looked at him, not with pity or calculation, but with simple human warmth. "This is terrifying," Evan admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Lila smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "For both of us," she agreed, "but maybe we could be terrified together over dinner. I noticed you have an amazing kitchen that looks like it's never been used." Despite everything, Evan felt his lips twitch upward in what might have been his first genuine smile in months. "I mostly order takeout," he confessed. "Perfect," Lila said, moving toward his kitchen with easy confidence. "I love to cook. Why don't you tell me what you like to eat, and I'll see what I can do with whatever's in your refrigerator." As Evan watched her open his pristine stainless steel refrigerator and begin pulling out ingredients he'd forgotten he owned, he realized his life had just changed forever. The woman in his kitchen wasn't just here to fulfill a contract, she was here to pull him back into the world of the living. Chapter 2. Breaking the Ice. Evan couldn't sleep for 3 nights straight. He'd lain in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of dinner with Lila, the way she'd hummed while cooking, completely at ease in his sterile kitchen, how she'd drawn him into conversation with questions about his work, his interests, his dreams, as if he were a normal person worthy of genuine curiosity. But it was the moment she touched his hand that haunted him most. When he'd reached for the salt at the same time she did, their fingers had brushed for maybe 3 seconds that had sent lightning through his entire nervous system, making him jerk back so violently he'd nearly knocked over his wine glass. Lila had apologized as if she'd done something wrong, but Evan had seen the flash of hurt in her beautiful brown eyes. Now it was Monday morning, and she was in his library. Evan stood outside the doorway like a teenager with his first crush, gathering the courage to enter his own house. Through the crack, he could see Lila curled up in his favorite reading chair, her legs tucked beneath her, completely absorbed in a worn copy of Jane Eyre. She'd changed from yesterday's dress into jeans and a soft cream sweater that made her skin glow, and her natural hair caught the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in his sterile, lonely world. "You can come in, you know," Lila said without looking up from her book, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I don't bite." Evan's face burned with embarrassment at being caught staring. "I didn't want to disturb your reading," he mumbled, stepping hesitantly into the room that had been his private sanctuary for years. "You're not disturbing me," Lila assured him, finally glancing up. When their eyes met, Evan felt that same electric jolt from the previous evening. "I was just thinking how incredible your library is. Most people with collections like this treat them as decoration." "I've read them all," Evan admitted, moving closer despite his nervousness. "Some of them multiple times." Lila's face lit up with genuine delight. "Really? Even the Bronte sisters?" "Especially the Bronte sisters," Evan said, surprised by his own boldness. Emily was a genius, but Charlotte understood passion in a way that was revolutionary for her time. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, and Evan immediately regretted speaking. Lila was probably just being polite. Who wanted to hear a reclusive millionaire ramble about Victorian literature? But instead of looking bored, Lila set down her book and leaned forward with obvious interest. "What do you think about Rochester?" she asked. "Is he a romantic hero, or just a manipulative older man taking advantage of Jane's inexperience?" For the next hour, they debated literature with an intensity that made Evan forget his shyness. Lila was brilliant, not just educated, but genuinely passionate about books and ideas. She challenged his interpretations, made him see familiar stories from new angles, and laughed at his dry observations in a way that made his chest feel warm and tight. "You should be teaching," Evan said when their conversation naturally paused. "You have insights that would inspire students." Lila's smile faltered slightly. "That's the plan, eventually, once I finish my dissertation and find a position. But right now—" She gestured vaguely, and Evan remembered why she was here: the medical bills, the 6-month contract his parents had arranged, the desperation that had brought her to answer their advertisement. "Your mother," Evan said gently. "How is she responding to treatment?" "Stage 3, breast cancer," Lila replied, her voice carefully controlled. "The treatment is experimental and expensive, but the doctors think there's a real chance of remission if we can afford to continue." The pain in her voice made Evan's chest ache. He wanted to fix this for her, to write a check that would solve all her problems, but he sensed that would only make her feel worse about their arrangement. "Tell me about her," he said instead. "What's she like?" Lila's face softened as she began describing her Mathera retired teacher who'd raised Lila alone, who still volunteered at literacy programs despite her illness, who worried more about her daughter's future than her own prognosis. As she spoke, Evan found himself leaning closer, drawn not just by her words but by the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about someone she loved. "She'd like you," Lila said suddenly. "She always said the best men are the ones who read books and actually think about what they mean." Evan's heart skipped several beats. "She knows about this arrangement?" "God, no." Lila laughed, a sound like wind chimes that made Evan's stomach flutter. "She thinks I'm house-sitting for a wealthy family while they're traveling. If she knew the truth—" Lila shook her head. "She raised me to believe in love, in waiting for the right person. This would break her heart." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Evan wanted to say something comforting, but he didn't trust his voice. Instead, he stood abruptly and moved to his piano in the corner of the library. "Do you play?" Lila asked, following him with her eyes. "A little," Evan said, which was a massive understatement. Music had been his escape, even before computers, a way to express emotions he couldn't voice. His fingers found the keys automatically, beginning a piece he'd composed last year during a particularly lonely winter. The melody was melancholy but beautiful, filled with longing and unspoken dreams. As Evan played, he became lost in the music, forgetting Lila was watching, forgetting to be self-conscious about sharing something so personal. The notes flowed through him like a confession, telling the story of a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. When the last note faded, Evan remained frozen at the piano, afraid to look at Lila's reaction. What if she thought his music was pretentious? "That was beautiful," Lila whispered, and Evan turned to find her standing just behind him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something warm and subtle that made his head spin. "Did you compose it?" Evan nodded, not trusting his voice. Lila was so close he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could count her long lashes, could notice the way her lips parted slightly as she breathed. "It sounded like loneliness," she said softly, "but also like hope, like someone waiting for something beautiful to happen." Their eyes locked, and Evan felt the air between them charged with electricity. Lila's gaze dropped to his mouth for just a second before meeting his eyes again, and Evan's heart hammered against his ribs. She was going to kiss him. He could see it in her expression, in the way she swayed slightly closer. Panic seized him. Evan jerked backward so violently that the piano bench scraped across the hardwood floor. I have work to do," he stammered, practically running from the room. Behind him, he heard Lila's sigh, but she didn't follow. When he reached his office, Evan slammed the door and pressed his back against it, breathing hard. His entire body was shaking from that moment of almost contact, from the wanting that had nearly overwhelmed his fear. For the rest of the day, Evan hid in his office like a coward, ordering lunch to be delivered, and communicating with Lila only through awkward text messages. But even with a door between them, he could feel her presence in his house, like a beautiful disruption to his carefully ordered world. That evening, when he finally emerged for dinner, Lila acted as if nothing had happened. She'd cooked again, something that smelled incredible, and chatted easily about books, current events, anything except the moment by the piano, when they'd almost crossed a line neither of them was ready to acknowledge. But Evan noticed the way she was careful not to touch him when passing dishes. He noticed how she kept her distance when they moved around the kitchen. Most of all, he noticed the hurt she was trying to hide behind her smile. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling again, Evan realized he was falling for Lila Bennett. The woman his parents had hired to give him an heir was becoming something far more dangerous, someone he actually cared about. And that terrified him more than anything else in his carefully controlled world. Chapter 3. Walls Coming Down. "You can't live your entire life in this penthouse," Lila announced on Thursday morning, standing in Evan's doorway with her hands on her hips and determination blazing in her eyes. "When's the last time you experienced unfiltered sunlight?" Evan looked up from his laptop, where he'd been hiding behind code for the past hour, trying not to think about how Lila's morning routine had become the highlight of his day, the way she hummed while making coffee, how she always saved him the last piece of toast, the unconscious grace with which she moved through his space as if she belonged there. "I get plenty of vitamin D from supplements," Evan said weakly, minimizing the video conference window where his CTO was updating him on their latest project. His company's brilliant team had learned to function with his remote leadership style, but even they were starting to notice his increased distraction. "And the UV rays are actually harmful." "Get dressed," Lila interrupted, moving into his office with that confident stride that made his pulse quicken. "We're going to Central Park." "I don't do parks," Evan protested, even as his treacherous body responded to her proximity. She was wearing a sundress today, something yellow and flowing that made her skin glow like warm honey. "Too many people, too many variables." "Exactly," Lila smiled, and Evan felt his resolve crumbling like a house of cards. "You need variables, Evan. You need chaos and noise, and the beautiful messiness of real life." 20 minutes later, Evan found himself walking down Fifth Avenue beside the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, wondering how she'd managed to convince him to leave his sanctuary. The city assaulted his scent scar horns, construction noise, the smell of hot dogs and exhaust, but somehow, with Lila's hand tucked into the crook of his elbow, it felt manageable. "See," Lila said as they entered the park, "the world didn't end." Evan was about to reply when Lila suddenly stopped walking, her attention caught by an ice cream vendor. "Oh my God, it's been years since I've had a good ice cream cone. Do you want one?" Before Evan could protest that he didn't eat sugar or dairy or food from questionable street vendors, Lila was already ordering 2 cones of vanilla ice cream. She handed him one with such obvious pleasure that Evan found himself accepting it despite his better judgment. "Thank you," he said, unsure what to do with the rapidly melting dessert. Lila had no such hesitation. She took a long, slow lick of her ice cream, her pink tongue darting out to catch a drop that threatened to escape down the side of the cone. Evan watched, mesmerized, as she closed her eyes in apparent bliss. She sighed. "Perfect." Evan nearly dropped his cone. The sound she'd made was innocently sensual, but it sent heat rushing through his body like liquid fire. He tried to take a bite of his own ice cream, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. "You okay?" Lila asked, noticing his distress. "Fine," Evan managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Just not used to this." They found a bench overlooking the lake, and for the next hour, Lila entertained him with stories about her childhood in Detroit, her dreams of teaching, her mother's outrageous opinions about modern literature. Evan found himself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. Lila's joy was infectious, pulling him out of his shell despite his determination to stay safely hidden. "You have a beautiful laugh," Lila said suddenly. her voice soft with something that might have been affection. "You should do it more often." Evan felt heat creep up his neck. "I don't have much to laugh about, usually." "Maybe you just need the right company," Lila suggested, and when Evan looked at her, he found her watching him with an expression that made his heart stutter. Dark clouds had been gathering while they talked, and suddenly the sky opened up in a torrential downpour. Other park visitors scattered, running for shelter, but Evan and Lila were caught in the open with nowhere to go. "This way!" Lila grabbed Evan's hand, pulling him toward a small pavilion 50 yards away. They ran through the rain together, Lila laughing like a child while Evan focused on the feel of her fingers interlaced with his. By the time they reached shelter, they were both soaked through. Lila's yellow dress clung to her curves, and her hair hung in dark tendrils around her face. She looked like a goddess emerging from a river, wild and beautiful and completely unself-conscious. Evan, meanwhile, felt like a drowned rat. "That was amazing," Lila exclaimed, wringing water from her hair. "I love summer storms." Evan was staring. He couldn't help it. The wet fabric of her dress revealed the outline of her body in ways that made his mouth go dry and his blood burn. When Lila noticed his gaze, her cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away. "You're staring," she whispered. "I'm sorry," Evan started to say, but Lila stepped closer, cutting off his apology. "Don't apologize," she said softly. "I like the way you look at me." Evan's breath caught in his throat. They were only inches apart now, close enough that he could see water droplets clinging to her eyelashes. Could feel the warmth radiating from her body despite the cool rain. "Lila," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She moved even closer, rising on her tiptoes, her face tilted up toward his. "It's okay, Evan. You can touch me." For a moment, Evan was paralyzed by want. Every cell in his body screamed at him to kiss her, to finally cross the line they'd been dancing around for days. But then panic seized him again. What if he did it wrong? What if she realized how inexperienced he was? What if a crack of thunder made them both jump, breaking the spell? Evan stepped back, running, shaking hands through his wet hair. "We should go back," he said, his voice barely steady. "You'll catch cold." Disappointment flashed across Lila's face before she masked it with a smile. "Of course. You're probably right." The walk back to his building was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. In the elevator, Evan stood as far from Lila as possible, not trusting himself to maintain control if she got too close again. But he could feel her watching him, could sense her hurt and confusion at his rejection. Back in the penthouse, Lila excused herself to change into dry clothes while Evan did the same. When they met again in the kitchen for dinner, both of them had retreated behind careful politeness, as if the moment in the pavilion had never happened. "I thought I'd make pasta tonight," Lila said, keeping her voice deliberately light. "Something simple." "That sounds perfect," Evan replied, grateful for the normalcy of routine. But cooking together proved to be its own form of torture. The kitchen forced them into close proximity, and every accidental brush of hands or arms sent electricity shooting through Evan's nervous system. When Lila needed something from the cabinet above his head, she had to reach across him, her breasts pressing briefly against his back. Evan bit back a groan, his knuckles white as he gripped the counter. "Sorry," Lila murmured, but her voice was breathless, and Evan could feel her trembling too. The real test came when Lila was making the sauce and somehow managed to get flour in her hair. Without thinking, Evan reached up to brush it away, his fingers tangling in her soft curls. Lila went perfectly still at his touch, her eyes closing as if savoring the contact. "Evan," she whispered, and the way she said his name like a prayer, like a plenarily, shattered his control entirely. He was going to kiss her. Every rational thought fled his mind as he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones. Lila's lips parted in invitation, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. Then the smoke alarm went off. They sprang apart, both of them breathing hard as Lila rushed to turn off the burner where the sauce had begun to burn. Evan stood frozen, watching her move around the kitchen with quick efficiency, his body still humming with unfulfilled desire. "Crisis averted," Lila said with forced cheerfulness, but Evan could see the hurt in her eyes. 2 almost kisses in one day, and he'd ruined both of them. That night, Evan lay in bed, replaying every moment, every touch, every look that had passed between them. His body ached with want, but his mind was a battlefield of fear and longing. He was falling for Lila had already fallen, if he was honest, but his terror of intimacy was stronger than his desire. Down the hall, Lila was probably lying awake too, wondering why the man who looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the world kept pulling away every time she got close. Evan closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same exquisite torture, more moments of connection followed by his inevitable retreat, more proof that he was too damaged, too broken to deserve someone as incredible as Lila Bennett. But God help him, he didn't want her to leave. Chapter 4. The First Touch. Evan woke to the sound of coughing. At first, he thought he was dreaming. In the weeks since their rain-soaked afternoon in Central Park, he'd become accustomed to the soft sounds of Lila moving through his penthouse, her morning humming, the gentle clink of dishes, the whisper of pages turning when she read in his library. But this was different, harsh. Painful coughs that seemed to tear from her throat. He found her in the kitchen, doubled over the sink, her body shaking with each violent spasm. She was still in her pajamas, a simple white cotton set that somehow looked elegant on her. But her usual grace was gone, replaced by the unsteady movements of someone fighting illness. Lila, Evan approached cautiously, his heart clenching at the sight of her distress. Are you okay? She turned toward him, and Evan felt his chest tighten with worry. Her beautiful brown eyes were glassy with fever. Her cheeks flushed unnaturally bright against her dark skin. When she tried to speak, another coughing fit seized her, leaving her gasping for breath. I'm fine, she managed to whisper. But the lie was obvious even to someone as socially inexperienced as Evan. Just a little cold. You're burning up, Evan said, and without thinking, he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. The moment his skin touched hers, everything changed. The contact was electric, but not in the usual way that made him panic and retreat. This was different, protective, tender, necessary. Lila's skin was scorching beneath his fingers, confirming what he already knew. She had a serious fever, and she was trying to hide it from him. You need to be in bed, Evan said firmly, surprised by his own authority. Now, I was going to make breakfast, Lila protested weakly, but she swayed on her feet, and Evan instinctively reached out to steady her. His hands found her waist, and through the thin cotton of her pajamas, he could feel the heat radiating from her body. She felt so small, so fragile, and the fierce protectiveness that surged through him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The only thing you're making is yourself sicker, Evan said, guiding her gently toward the guest bedroom where she'd been staying. Come on. Lila didn't have the strength to argue. She leaned into Evan's support, her head falling against his shoulder as they walked slowly down the hall. The simple trust of the gesture, the way she allowed him to take care of her, made Evan's throat tight with emotion. In her bedroom, Evan helped her settle under the covers, his movements careful and reverent. When Lila immediately began shivering despite the fever, Evan pulled the blankets up to her chin, his fingers brushing her neck as he tucked the fabric around her. I'll be right back, he promised, and for the first time since she'd arrived, leaving her side felt physically painful. Evan had never taken care of anyone in his life. His parents had always hired professionals when he was sick, maintaining their emotional distance even during his childhood illnesses. But now, faced with Lila's vulnerability, instincts he didn't know he possessed took over. He returned with a thermometer, a glass of water, and fever reducer from his meticulously stocked medicine cabinet. Lila's temperature was 102, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, high enough to warrant serious concern. We should call the doctor, Evan said, already reaching for his phone. No. Lila grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers circling his arm like a brand. Please, I can't afford emergency room bills, and it's just the flu. I'll be fine in a few days. The mention of money made Evan's chest ache. Here she was, sick and feverish, still worrying about medical expenses when he could afford the best care in the city without thinking twice. Money isn't, he started to say, but Lila's eyes were already drifting closed, the fever pulling her under. For the next 3 days, Evan barely left her side. He worked from his laptop in the chair beside her bed, monitoring her breathing while he coded. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could manage a multi-million-dollar company remotely, but watching Lila sleep peacefully was the most important task he'd ever undertaken. He cooked simple soups, though his culinary skills were limited to following online recipes with obsessive precision. When Lila was awake enough to eat, he would sit beside her on the bed, gently spooning broth between her lips, his heart clenching every time she managed a grateful smile. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, after he'd spent 20 minutes convincing her to eat half a bowl of chicken soup. "I want to," Evan replied, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "I need to." The most intimate moment came on the second evening, when Lila's fever spiked dangerously high, and she was too weak to protest his help. Evan ran a lukewarm bath, his hands shaking as he tested the water temperature again and again. When he returned to the bedroom, Lila was shivering despite the fever, her pajamas soaked with perspiration. "I need to get you cooled down," Evan said gently. "The bath will help." Lila nodded weakly, and Evan felt his face burn as he realized what he was offering to do. But this wasn't about desire or attraction. This was about saving the woman he was falling in love with. With infinite care, Evan helped Lila to the bathroom, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out. He turned away as she undressed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming that this was too intimate, too much. But when Lila made a soft sound of distress, Evan turned back without thinking. She was sitting in the tub, her knees drawn up to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so weak. I can't even take care of myself." "You're not weak," Evan said fiercely, dropping to his knees beside the tub without a thought for his expensive clothes. "You're sick. There's a difference." Evan reached for a washcloth, his movements careful and reverent as he helped cool her fevered skin. This wasn't about the contract or the arrangement his parents had made. This was about the woman who had stumbled into his life and turned everything upside down. Every gentle stroke of the cloth was a confession he couldn't voice yet. Every tender touch a promise he was afraid to make. "Thank you," Lila breathed. Her eyes closed as Evan's ministrations began to ease her discomfort. "Always," Evan replied without thinking, the words slipping out like a vow. He changed cool cloths on her forehead every hour, his hands growing more confident with each tender touch. During the long nights, when Lila's fever made her restless and delirious, Evan would read to her from her favorite books, his voice steady and soothing, even when exhaustion made his eyes burn. On the second night, when Lila's fever spiked to 103, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, Evan thought he might lose his mind with worry. She was delirious, mumbling about her mother, about classes she needed to teach, about a contract she couldn't fulfill. Evan sat beside her in the dark, using a damp washcloth to cool her burning skin, whispering reassurances he hoped she could hear. "I'm here," he murmured, stroking the cloth along her temples, down her neck, across her shoulders with infinite gentleness. "You're safe. Just rest." When his fingers accidentally tangled in her hair, those beautiful curls damp with perspiration, Lila turned her face toward his touch with a soft sigh. Even in her fevered state, she seemed to find comfort in his presence. "Evan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he repeated, setting aside the cloth to brush a curl away from her face. "What do you need? Don't leave," she pleaded, her hand searching blindly until it found his. "Please." Evan's breath caught as Lila's fingers intertwined with his. It was the first time she'd initiated contact, the first time he hadn't immediately pulled away. Her hand was small and warm in his, her grip surprisingly strong despite her illness. "I won't leave," Evan promised, settling more comfortably in his chair without breaking their connection. "I'll stay right here." Lila's breathing gradually evened out, her grip on his hand relaxing as she slipped into deeper sleep. But Evan didn't let go. He sat there through the night, watching her face in the dim light filtering through the curtains, marveling at how natural it felt to hold her hand, to be needed by someone who mattered more to him than his own comfort. By the third morning, Lila's fever had broken. Evan Wokade finally dozed off in the chair around Danto, find her watching him with clear, alert eyes. "You stayed," she said softly, her voice still weak but no longer fevered. "I promised I would," Evan replied, suddenly aware that they were still holding hands. He should let go. He should retreat to his usual safe distance. But Lila's thumb was tracing gentle circles across his knuckles, and the sensation was hypnotic. "Thank you," Lila whispered, For taking care of me. I know this isn't what you signed up for. Neither is this, Evan said quietly, lifting their joined hands to press a soft kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was tender, intimate, and completely spontaneous. Lila's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted in the bed, making room beside her. You must be exhausted, she said. Lie down, please. Evan hesitated. Sharing a bed, even innocently, felt like crossing a massive line. But the invitation in Lila's eyes was too compelling to resist. Carefully, still holding her hand, he stretched out on top of the covers beside her. They lay facing each other, their joined hands resting between them on the pillow. In the soft morning light, Lila looked ethereal, her fever-flushed cheeks returning to their normal warm brown, her hair spread across the white pillowcase like dark silk. I was scared, Lila admitted quietly, when the fever was really bad. I kept thinking about my mother, about what would happen to her if something happened to me. Nothing's going to happen to you, Evan said fiercely, surprising himself with his vehemence. I won't let it. Lila smiled, the expression soft and wondering. You're not what I expected, Evan Harper. What did you expect? Evan asked, genuinely curious. Someone cold, calculating. Someone who saw this arrangement as purely transactional. Lila's thumb resumed its gentle stroking across his hand.